try to do a good job anyway and not ruin the debate for everyone else, even though obviously nobody has any chance of breaking here. I am Omar. I usually like to be referred to as he, but I'm not offended no matter what you say pretty much. Will the rest of the panel introduce themselves?
I'm Gautier. I prefer you. Josh, he's nice.
Right. Opening government, who's speaking first and how would you like to be referred to?
Richard, your name please.
Stephen, he please.
Opening opposition?
Marlena. And we're both on she or they.
Sorry?
We're both on she or they.
Closing government?
Adam speaking first, we're both he or they.
And closing opposition?
Michael speaking first, preferred pronoun he.
Dean Thomas, also he.
Alright, good luck. Let's have a great debate. I call the Prime Minister to open the debate. acting Prime Minister and call the Leader of Opposition.
Ladies and gentlemen, when writing the Dayton Accords, a Norwegian diplomat famously said, "You can have an imperfect peace or you can have a perfect war." On side opposition, we firmly believe that the proposition model is going to create the kind of long-standing wars which will not be stopped because we prefer often unpopular and imperfect pieces. We want to talk about two things in open government today, in open opposition. First, we want to talk about why peace agreements will often be unpopular, specifically looking at why publics are bad at deciding this, and second, looking at concessions and why these are important for peace agreements to go on. Second, we want to look at why peace agreements are a necessary step toward conflict resolution, even if they're only the first step, right? I have three outstanding points of rebuttal. The first is why people should be able to decide when this ends. It's the principled point that we're getting from opening. Unfortunately, right, we don't have referenda for whether or not governments go to war, or whether governments do a large number of other things that would also impact on this model. We think that insofar as we can tell you that wars are going to be longer and citizens' lives are going to be worse under your model, we think that we win the principled justification, insofar as obviously your prop is premised on making people's lives better and making wars less brutal, right? Second, you get a better peace because it stops one side from bullying each other, right? The first thing that we say about that is we think that there's already an incentive on groups to ensure that it's not going to be the case that they get completely screwed over by the peace agreement. Otherwise, it is unlikely that they're going to sign this. In the case that they will not sign this because they think that they're getting too screwed over, right, under your metric, what's going to happen instead is wars are just going to be longer and more protracted and more drawn out. It is unclear to me why that is a better situation, especially because we think that you get a lot of peace building mechanisms under ours. No thanks. Right. So we think that for every Belfast agreement that you have that was awesome and kind of created power sharing mechanisms, you also get the kinds of agreements that came out of the Rwandan genocide, which were hastily put together, very, very quick, but then after that what you got is a long-lasting peace agreement with international support, right? So we're happy with fine, incredibly short-term peace agreements which are instituted, which then go on and become entire peace-building processes. Lastly, with regards to corruption, so Ella's POI's response didn't get much of a response at all, right? So there are a lot of reasons why this mechanism doesn't make a particular amount of sense, because states in conflict, especially for the states that are undergoing civil wars, which is how you wanted to frame the debate, are states which are going to be heavily militarized, highly corrupt, they're also going to be very institutionally weak. It seems implausible that any election result that you get is going to be non-corrupt, as it were. So even if you invite in UN people to say whether or not there was a free and fair election, and then they're going to say no, there wasn't, and then the war is going to continue, right? Because it is implausible that the state, the group that doesn't want the peace agreement to go forward will not just rig the results, right? So we think that then the response to this is it's a zero-sum game, right? Exactly, which is why you don't do your policies, because it makes no difference. That's precisely the opposition, right? No thanks. If in the worst case scenario and it's corrupt and there's no relevance of it, then it's unclear why you would do the referendum in the first place if you admit that you can't do it, right? So going on to our substantive, we think that the reason that peace agreements are often going to be unpopular is because publics are really bad at making decisions like this, right? We think that war is a totalizing and radicalizing thing, which is often very, very brutal. So states where there are oftentimes states where populations are not going to vote for these peace agreements, and this is where we think the biggest harm comes from, right? So what do we point to? We point to overwhelming political science data, which proves that Palestinians who grew up during the first Intifada are considerably less likely to support negotiations with Israel than Palestinians who grew up during the Oslo Accords, right? This is also true of Israelis with regards to whether or not they want to negotiate with Palestinians. We think that war has a radicalizing impact on people, which makes people feel like their security is going to be underway. We think that this is what creates the problem of wars being longer, because they become winner take all as opposed to concession based. This is why Hamas now says that they require Israel to no longer exist, and they deny Israeli statehood. I'm delighted for the extension because they appear to agree with what we're saying, right? So yeah, Adam, go ahead.
So presumably the emergence of Hamas occurred after an incredibly bad peace agreement where the Israeli people thought that whether the Palestinians thought it was an illegitimate agreement. Hamas falls on our side and not yours.
Right. Okay. If there's going to be a massacre and there's going to be restarting of a war, then obviously that would require another peace agreement after. We're saying that even though they're imperfect sometimes, insofar as there's a possibility for them to be good or for them to lessen violence immediately, we get a net benefit for all the reasons I'm going to tell you after about nation building, right? So we think that also with regards to things like concessions, we think that oftentimes peace agreements have to concede things that people are not going to like because war has that totalizing influence that I was talking about before. It means things like Israelis don't want to do things like lift the Gaza blockade, even though that could potentially stop the war that's happening right now. And the reason they don't want to lift it is because they have considerable fears for their security, despite the fact that in many ways these fears are quite unfounded, given that the Iron Dome is incredibly effective at stopping missiles from coming in the first place, right? What we think, in addition to that, is if they stay unpopular, is that really a problem? We don't think it is, right? So we look at the Jordanian peace agreement with Israel, which is still incredibly unpopular, promotes a lot of discourse and debate around it, but we think that it did two things, which are really important. First of all, it normalized trade relations between Jordan and Israel. The second thing is a follow-on from that, which means it is allowed to be a bedrock of stability and security in an otherwise volatile region. That never would have happened if they did not have such a good relationship with Israel, unlike all of their neighbors. It is that kind of normalization that happens under our side, even when peace agreements are incredibly unpopular with their publics, because we think that peace is always preferable to war, right? So second, with regards to why peace agreements are a necessary step toward conflict resolution, we think that it begins often as a fragile peace, right? And so sometimes peace agreements fail under the status quo. That is absolutely true. However, sometimes they also do succeed. And what happens when they succeed? It begins a long peace process where a few things happen, three things in fact. The first thing is it tends to normalize trade, because then you can trade with the part of your country if it's an intrastate dispute, or another country if it's an interstate dispute. This means that these normalized trade relations do two things, right? So the first thing is it just grows the economies of the countries, and countries which are poor are less likely to go to war. Second thing is it means that you have to deal with people who would be the people that you would be bombing if you were to go to war again, right? So you have an economic incentive not to go to war with your main trade partners. Second thing, right? Because the process of nation building can only ever occur during peace. When everything is urgent and emotive and about your state's security, you can't do things like build a civil service. You can't do things like work on education reforms. As a result of that, these nations are just weaker, right? So we look at the states of former Yugoslavia and see that that nation building only happened after the Yugoslav wars ended. Thirdly, right, we think that there's a purely symbolic function that comes from this, right? So we think that leaders can be seen together at UN conferences, at the World Economic Forum, shaking hands, and that is the kind of thing that you don't get under side proposition because they are still at war. We think that imperfect peaces are considerably better than the types of drawn-out, horrific wars that side proposition seems keen to create. For all these reasons, delighted to oppose.
I thank the Leader of Opposition and call the Deputy Prime Minister. I thank the Deputy Prime Minister and call the Deputy Leader of Opposition.
Mr. Speaker, that speaker wanted to try to characterise our case as being that because this won't work everywhere, we shouldn't do it at all. The problem is that he's coming from a team who is desperately trying to cling to the hope that this might work anywhere at all, Mr. Speaker. The fact, like, they're desperately searching for a single example of a case in which this would work, and they cannot do it, Mr. Speaker. There are three things that I'm going to do for you in my speech today. The first one is talk quickly about the idea of corruption, why we think that at best this is a wash, but, well, at worst this is a wash, at best this is a point that falls to our side of the house. Next thing I'm going to do is talk about why it is we think that leaders are more likely to agree to peace agreements than the population at large. And then following on from this is the third point about why it is that a tentative peace is better than war and is a necessary step towards creating the kind of lasting peace that that side of the house want as much as we do. So to begin with, the idea of corruption. What we told you very early on in this debate, and a point of information, is that most of these regimes are incredibly corrupt and incredibly militarized. And, you know, like, because they're in warfare, they're dealing generally with kind of lots of irregularities in the way that things are conducted, right? What that means is that it's highly unlikely that you're going to be able to trust the result of these referendums, of these referenda when they're conducted, right? Well, that side of the house, that's a reason why we think that it's basically pointless to conduct these referenda, okay? So at that point, it's basically a wash whether you do this or not, right? Like, it's functionally a pointless policy, and therefore we think we shouldn't bother to implement it. But we actually think it's worse than that, Mr. Speaker, because when you have both actual corruption, or even if you don't, you have like incredibly easy accusations of corruption. We think what that means is that having asked the people for their views and then ignored them is like a new grievance that they can then take up against the state, right? So we think that that's like an additional reason why you're probably going to get harms coming out of this. No, thank you. What we think is much more important, though, is what this actually does for the nature of peace agreements, right? So the first thing is we were a little confused by a lot of the material coming out of this side, which seemed to be premised on the idea that these were like peace agreements being put forward by like citizens activist groups for peace or something, right? Like, this motion is clearly something that's about a proposed peace agreement that's been like negotiated by leaders being taken to the public before it is like finally assented to, right? So firstly, we think that all of the material about the industrial military complex like has absolutely no weight at all in this debate because of the fact that that complex has already been overcome at the point that leaders have entered the negotiations that came up with the peace agreement that's being put forward for referendum. So we think like most of the speech that you heard prior to mine is largely irrelevant in this debate. What we've told you moreover, though, is that we think that the totalizing influence that war has on citizens means that citizens are much less likely to agree to peace than leaders are. There's a number of reasons for that. The first one is that we think that government leaders have more accurate information about like the trade-offs that they need to make in security situations, right? Why is that? It's because, firstly, governments are the ones who control security gathering up apparatus, and secondly, governments have a direct incentive to hype up to the public how bad the security situation is, right? That means that publics are generally going to misperceive what the risks and what the trade-offs are because of the fact that governments have much better information about them but don't necessarily want to give that information to the public because a high risk, like a high security risks are really useful for justifying the kind of invasive policies that governments tend to pursue in times of war. The next thing is that governments have access to like brokering and formal negotiations, right? So they go to forums like the World Economic Forum or the United Nations, and like Bill Clinton or Tony Blair or someone like sits down with them and helps them talk it out, right? Like, that's something that, again, we think that the public isn't necessarily privy to. Thirdly, we think that government politicians often take a longer term view on these things. Why is that? It's because leaving behind like a burgeoning, growing economy is like a better legacy to leave behind than a bombed out city, right? That's an incentive that might play on a political leader, but that doesn't necessarily, like, is less easy for the public who are like caught up in the kind of raw immediate grief of war. I'll take closing.
Why is it not fine for these politicians to communicate the long-term ambitions and the accurate information at the point of the referendum to persuade people to get on board?
Yeah, it is fine, right? But it's a massive risk for a politician or a political leader to take at the point that you don't know whether the referendum's going to pass or not. If the referendum fails, you're left still in a state of war, but now having disclosed a whole lot of the secret security information that you previously had and made it publicly available, right? That's like a massive massive risk for you to take, and so one that you're not going to want to do. Let's take a look then at why it is we think that tentative peace is better than war and is a necessary step towards a much more lasting peace. No, thank you. We on our side of the House are perfectly happy to concede that many peace agreements are imperfect. Many peace agreements are followed by periods of some instability, right? And some peace agreements fail and collapse entirely. What we say on our side of the House, though, is that getting a peace agreement in the first place is the first step towards trying to make sure that that doesn't happen. We gave you a number of reasons for this that went largely unresponded to by this side of the House. Firstly, we told you about trade, the fact that it builds mutual reliance between parties to a conflict, and also that it fosters economic development, which makes parties richer and therefore allows them to be less prone to war generally. No, thank you. Next, we told you that these facilitate nation building, right? That when you want to define your national identity in ways that are not just directly oppositional to the party which you have previously been warring with, if you want to start building a national identity through things like sports, through things like the development of a civil service and a civil society and stuff like that. You can't do that at a time when you're caught up in the urgency and the emotion of war. And so we think that that's another incredibly important benefit to having a peace agreement, even a tentative one. No, thank you. The next thing we told you is that it allows leaders to take symbolic steps to be seen and photographed together. We told you, most importantly, that it allows policies towards minorities within that state to be normalized, right? So you have, when you're not at war with a group anymore, less need to brand that group as terrorists and less ability to implement emergency extra legal measures against those kinds of minority groups, right? When you don't have the need to do that, that means you can start to treat those minorities within your country a little better, and that means that you have less likelihood for latent ethnic tensions to continue to fester and to potentially erupt into violence. And most importantly and most obviously, we think, ladies and gentlemen, it also means that violence is no longer state sanctioned. It means that you can dispatch them Marines, or you can dispatch the police or whatever to clamp down on skirmishes when those kinds of things do start to erupt. We think all of these things mean that, yeah, peace is mostly going to be imperfect and is never necessarily going to be absolutely ideal in all situations. But we think that when you start to reach peace agreements, even if they are not entirely popular universally, that's when you start to take steps towards being able to develop all of the kinds of mutual reliances we're talking about on our side of the House, which mean that we think ours is the side that stands for most likely lasting peace in a very problematic world. That's why we're very proud to oppose this motion.
I thank the Deputy Leader of Opposition and all the Member of Government.
Mr. Speaker, when Yasser Arafat shook hands with Israeli and American diplomats as part of the Oslo Accords, Hamas enormously strengthened in terms of its recruitment, and the PLO lost its legitimacy and its ability to be the sole legitimate representative of the Palestinian people. When peace agreements occur that don't have public support or are perceived not to have public support, third parties emerge that begin further conflicts and break that imperfect peace. In terms of how our extension fits in with the rest of the debate. In terms of the top half, the stuff like civil war, they're right? At their very best, that they've made this point awash. They say they're desperately trying to find a case. They're more proper nouns about Sri Lanka than I've ever heard ever, so they clearly do have a case about this. But at the best, that's awash. So then let's look at their harms that are left standing, right? That we want an imperfect peace because you get less dying, more trade, and a system of nation building, right? This is how they've emphasised the whole way through their case. We think on the comparative, that is enormously outweighed when you have the risk, the potential, and indeed, as I'm going to go on to say, the actual situation where you have long-term conflicts formed by parties that contest that peace deal in the real term. You have more dying in future conflicts, less trade, and a nation-building system warped by contested legitimacies. That sounded nice, didn't it? Okay, 2 points then. Actually, no, the 1 point in this extension. Non-state actors, why they exist, and why it's better if you either have a situation where you agree with where the referendum is passed or where the referendum is not passed. In both situations, it is better in not allowing these non-state actors and these third parties to emerge and to warp and continue conflicts. And the end of conflicts are necessarily messy, right? There is always going to be ambiguous terms, highly emotive situations occurred, and numerous possible outcomes, right? They are never going to be a situation in which there is an easy option. So the best situation is one where you form a lasting peace that has consensus, right? The whole point of these, sounds trivial, right? The whole point of these peace agreements is to have a lasting peace. If they were just a stopgap, there'd be ceasefires, right? These are meant to be peace agreements which can last for a substantial amount of time. Let's look at a couple of situations where this didn't happen. The Oslo Accords in 1993, the PLO formed, right? The end of the Intifada, where from 87 onwards it had lost a huge amount of power. The PLO at this point was seen as the sole legitimate representative, which is why Yasser Arafat was allowed to go and form this agreement on the behalf of the Palestinian people. Hamas formed in 1998, saying that there was illegitimate leadership being shown by the broadly secular PLO in their forces, right? And they essentially said that these people are shafting us. They are not representing us well, and they are entering into agreements based on fear that do not get the aims we want, right? Particularly not recognizing the Israeli state and not giving up any state territory. No thanks, right? So these non-state actors exist, and this is why Hamas gained an enormous amount of power, and the Second Intifada was able to be defined by a system which was far more based on suicide bombings and more violent methods, right? They're unable to fully unite Fatah and Hamas underneath them, right? So this also happened, by the way, like historically, in terms of like finding examples of external conflicts between World War I and World War II, right? In as much as there were countries perceived that the Versailles Treaty had completely shafted them, and therefore looked to different political representatives in order to realise a new method which didn't buy into a peace they didn't see as legitimate. No thanks. So let's look at why this referendum changes this, right? Because I'm aware that was just like a lot of descriptive stuff. This mechanism changes this, or this world, the world in which we would like to live in terms of believing we should live in, changes things. Firstly, if populations agree to this, right? The main attack we get from opposition is they'll never agree, right? And they kind of say they'll never agree in as much as these situations are emotive, and they don't want to give up these positions. Firstly, there are numerous situations where more powerful countries there's been overwhelming popular support for ending conflicts due to high levels of casualties. This is true of Algeria and France, true of the US, one of the highly militarized states in Vietnam. And so, but then they give us some more nuance on this when they say, they can't actually put this to the public for them to agree because they can't disclose the full amount of information. When I POI them on this, they say, but there are security risks that they can't put on the table. I mean, this sounds nice. I don't know what that means, right? But there is some kind of nuclear site somewhere that they can't know about, which is essential to ending that conflict. Presumably, if that situation does exist, you can say there are serious security threats, i.e. weapons of mass destruction or whatever. Like, turns out that was a lie in terms of information. But you can say that there is a reason that we have to end this conflict. Tom?
What incentive would Israel have had to negotiate with the PLO at all if they thought that any agreement reached was just going to be rejected by the Palestinian people?
Because we don't think it is true that okay, so this is true, right? So firstly, as I'm telling you now, it is likely that there would have been agreement on that. The Oslo Accords at the time were seen to have some support. Right? This is why it's a comparative. There wasn't a referendum, so we don't know, right? So let's look at the Oslo Accords and public support. If you had this referendum and there was public support, which looks likely given that the Intifada had massively degraded from the kind of strong civil society push it was at the beginning of 1987 to what it became at the end of 1992, 1993, it had massively lost public support, and many of the institutions that had developed during that time to harbour civil society and nation building and out administering the Israeli government had begun to fall. It is quite likely that in order to end their children dying, people would have said, we want to agree to this position, right? And also, more importantly, the state that exists after the Oslo Accords isn't seen to have made that decision on its own, but instead the nation is seen to have made it, right? So the state isn't in a weak position if that goes poorly, right? And the important thing is there that if an organisation like Hamas comes out and says we were shafted, the people were betrayed, you can clearly point as the state that no, the public were consulted and they agreed to this. This is if they agree, right? We think it's like they will. But in terms of Tom's other one, if they don't agree, right? If the public say this isn't a peace we want, because this is like Marlena's stuff that it is better to have an imperfect peace than a perfect war. Like, it's a nice phrase, but it's nonsense, right? Because actually we don't want an imperfect peace, because it is those imperfect pieces that lead to long-term conflicts that are substantially worse than the conflict was ended in the first place. It is clearly true that the first Intifada was less damaging than the second, right? And that the second Intifada was bad, but still the situation at the moment is worse, right? We're in a worse situation and a more tractable situation, and it is just trivially true numerically that more people have died now that that conflict has increased, right? So let's talk about this idea of like no peace versus false peace, right? Because we think that it is better that that peace is thrown out there, so the Oslo Accords are not something we recognise, because there is clearly still on the comparative that inertia towards peace, right? In as much as those Oslo Accords were intimated in the first place. But then the Palestinians or the PLO can say, look, we cannot sell this to our population, right? We need to have a new agreement which we can sell to our population and which has their legitimacy. We think this might be difficult. We agree that that particular conflict might go on for longer. Why are we fine with that? Two reasons that if there is an imperfect peace which doesn't have buy-in and doesn't have public support and is agreed to by leaders will be harmful, right? Firstly, you renew that conflict outside of a diplomatic framework. You have non-state actors who challenge the state's legitimacy to have made that decision and therefore seek to build on the public support for that particular conflict or the continuation of that conflict, to gain political capital, to gain power, to challenge that state's ability to exist, and therefore to start either guerrilla or terrorist conflicts on its behalf, right? Or the second option is that they then seize power of the state, that this resentment exists and continues, and they take political power. You then have a new state, which is formed with a party which had the founding belief that the previous government, when it formed that peace agreement, betrayed them, and that this conflict needs to continue. Their founding myth is that they need to continue fighting because those that fought previously had failed, and that the only way to reach solution is through conflict. Mr. Speaker, clearly what's important in this debate is that we have long-term and lasting peace. An imperfection, if that imperfection is a lack of public support, is not an imperfection we're willing to accept, an imperfection which massively decreases their benefits in the long term. For all these reasons, very, very happy to propose.
I thank the member of government and call the member of opposition.
Cool. Give me two shakes for that.
Ready? Two things. First, why good pieces are less likely, or indeed any piece is less likely, on their side of the house. Second, even if you buy that there is some ambiguity about the quality of peace, the resulting degree to which the guilt is collectivized means that the ensuing state will always be worse on their side of the house, because it was a peace offer that not just the government made, not just a political disagreement between two governments, but rather something that the citizens of that state voted for and that they are culpable for. You're more likely to hold the individuals you interact with on a daily basis and who compose that other race directly responsible for that peace. So, first off, direct response to closing governments. They told us the PLO lost legitimacy as a result of the Oslo Accords because it didn't ask people about them. One, that's only true if the Oslo Accords are a bad thing, right? And most Palestinians think it's a bad idea. We're not sure that's going to be the case the majority of the time when states make peace. But secondly, and perhaps more importantly, right, like, the agreement is more likely to be bad on your side of the house. Because when we structure an agreement, we offer concessions back and forth, right? You're much more likely to accept concessions at the point at which someone is saying, look, I'm offering you peace, rather than, look, if people who you probably mistrust vote for peace, I am offering you peace, right? You're likely to get better concessions by making the more concrete and plausible offer. So the peace that you get is likely to be worse on your side, so the backlash that you're talking about is likely to be worse on your side. But you say, oh, no, we voted for it, therefore we're definitely not going to hate it. I can come up with numerous examples of government policies related to the military that people have voted for and dislike. Perhaps the best example would be the Iraq War, which most Americans supported at the time at which it happened, and then were less happy about a little bit later on. Moving on. Three things. First off, why a government that wants war can always get it in their world. Secondly, why peace is less likely on your side of the house because of worse settlements. And finally, the racialization and collectivization of guilt that occurs. Beginning with why the governments that want war can. The reason we asked the clarification at the beginning is because who initiates these sorts of referenda is pretty crucial, right? If the state gets to offer it, presumably they will not offer the referendum unless they're happy with, that they would make peace under that scenario, right? Otherwise, the state, what on earth is my incentive to offer a referendum, right? So, clearly, if the state wants to keep on having war, it can presumably keep on having war, right? Moreover, however, if the state really wants to keep on having war, but people are quite angry at it, and so there is a disincentive to do that, it can appease those people by saying, let's have a referendum on a really terrible peace offer that asks for horrific concessions. Then people reject it, and they say, look, one, the peace offer was in bad faith, so obviously peace isn't possible, but two, you citizens rejected it. Crucially, there are always going to be peaceniks and there are always going to be warmongers. The key question in this debate is what happens to the waverers. On your side, the waverers are much less likely to agree because the key things that lead to people supporting peace are 1, a mistrust of their own government, and 2, a trust of the other side. That is reduced at the point at which a peace offer is voted on and rejected, because you're more likely to trust your own government for saying they want to continue with war at the point at which a crap peace offer is offered, but more importantly, you're less likely to trust the other people because a crap peace offer was offered. So governments can actually perpetuate war much more easily and appease popular unrest against continuing conflicts. Secondly, why are good negotiated settlements more likely? Peace requires lots of concessions. These guys are like, no, it's just something you can write on a napkin. No, it's an incredibly complex process with lots and lots of concessions, including, but not limited to, reparations, both monetary and land, right? Like disarmament, symbolic concessions, democratic concessions in terms of the constitution of the ensuing state, right? Crucially, in order to get these concessions, you have to offer something. There's a give and take. And at the point at which anything you offer is, 1, speculative, right, in that it's all contingent upon popular support turning out. And I think these guys are right to say it's hard to gauge that popular support in the environment of an active conflict, right? YouGov don't tend to give people Kevlar. But secondly, and more importantly, right, people are less likely to believe that those concessions are actually going to materialise, and thus believe that they're willing to offer things in exchange. Why? Because war is often built on a mistrust of the opposite side, right? Government, not only is this often why the war emerged in the first place, see Israel-Palestine, right? But secondly, and more importantly, governments actively perpetuate to continue to get people to support the war, because when you say the other people are a threat to us and our racial identity, they cannot be trusted, right? You're much more likely to support the war effort because you see yourself as combating an existential threat. What does this mean? 1, the government is less likely to trust the other side because presumably they buy their own bullshit, otherwise we wouldn't be in a state of war in the first place. But secondly, the ordinary citizens are less likely to trust the other side as well, because now the peace offering isn't just contingent on what's on the table, but on the other side agreeing to what's on the table, which presumably you don't believe is particularly likely, since you mistrust them, which is why you're in the conflict and why the conflict is perpetuated in the last place. So it becomes much harder to get palatable peace offerings. So even if you guys get more votes, what you're voting on is going to be worse. So even if they're slightly better disposed to what they're voting on, because it's so much worse, you still get less peace on your side of the house. How do you like them apples, Richard?
So, the dominance of one side over another and the self-interest of senior politicians necessarily means that there are no concessions in peace agreements which are put forward to the other side. Now, in order for that peace agreement to be accepted at all, there have to be concessions. Don't we get more on our side of the house?
No, look, right? It's a little bit more complicated than that, right? Concessions still happen, right? Even if the concessions don't happen in a positive sense, they still happen in a negative sense in terms of making the terms of peace less severe on the losing side, right? So to say there are no concessions just because the conflict is asymmetric is a myth. But moreover, right, sometimes, like, you get peace when the conflict is not asymmetric. And in those scenarios, your policy makes things much worse. Let's talk about why this leads to a worse aftermath, because these guys are right to set this in terms of civil wars. That is where this debate has the biggest impact. Crucially, if you believe whether it's ambiguous or not, whether it will get you more peace, you should still side with our side, because all things being equal, right, that peace is likely to be worse. Why? Recognise that for the reason they tell you, because the peace is likely to be formed in a state of asymmetric warfare, right, one side's going to feel they were under duress at the time which they made the agreement. That means it is likely, as they say, to be harsher on one side than the other. What does this mean, right? It means that later on down the line, people are going to say, look, we were at gunpoint and they made us take these concessions. This is what happened with the Treaty of Versailles, and we all know how that story ends, Mr. Speaker. Crucially, this builds up at the point at which it was the people of that country who voted for that agreement, right, who tricked us through the coercive force into accepting that agreement. But now, it's not just the fault of the politicians, it's not just a disagreement about some politicality, it's a clash of identity and race. Why? Because the people of that race imposed this agreement on us. They supported it, it was their agreement. It was the agreement of every citizen in that race, which is why they voted for it. What does this mean? 1, you're less likely to trust those people and want to interact with them, even live in the same neighbourhood, build up those networks of interdependence that are necessary for true reconciliation. Secondly, you're more likely to be radicalised politically, at the point at which it's not just the fault of some politicians who can go away, but the result of people of a racial identity which is unlikely to change. What does this mean? 1, you're less likely to get a state where people are properly politically satisfied. But secondly, conflict is likely to re-emerge again, because we recognise that political disagreements are often the spark that lights the bonfire here. And when those political disagreements are more likely to realise because of less interdependence, because of more political fragmentation, you get more probability of future war. So even if you think we get roughly equally imperfect agreements on both sides, you still support us, because at the end of the day, it's the citizens' fault on your side, whereas it's just the fault of Slobodan Milosevic on ours. I'm exceptionally proud to oppose.
I thank the member of opposition and call the government with.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The side that wins this debate has to be the side that provides actual long-term peace. Not short-term peace which then drifts back into war, not short-term peace that involves rockets and airstrikes and children dying. That isn't actually peace. That's occupation and that's violence. That's not what we want to provide on our side of the house. We want to provide long-term peace and stability. I'm going to talk to you about two things today, incredibly comparative. First of all, what happens without these referenda? What is the situation without these referenda? Secondly, what is the situation with these referenda? Looking at both what happens when we agree and when we don't agree to the proposal placed in front of us. First of all, though, 3 points of rebuttal to Michael's speech. First of all, he says citizens never actually concede ever to any sort of peace deals, like they just don't like doing it. First of all, yes, they do, right? We look at, for example, the US and Vietnam. See, like, did concede to popular ideological pressure to move away from Vietnam. It wasn't a referendum, but they knew exactly what the people wanted, and they moved out, right? They do concede to losing strategic objectives when popular support isn't on their side. Secondly, France left Algeria, leaving vast amounts of land, vast amounts of money, vast amounts of empire they could previously have had, knowing that popular support wasn't on their side. People make these concessions to avoid war, because surprisingly, Michael, people consider not being at war more important than other strategic objectives, right? Sometimes peace is such a prize to be won, they're willing to take those concessions. No, thank you. Secondly, he says that peace is much less likely, right? And he says, oh, because you have to make concessions. And we go, yes. First of all, see point one. People are willing to make concessions when peace, genuine peace, is on the table. That is good. But secondly, right, you need to have that discussion about what concessions you are willing to make for that peace. Because at the point at which you make concessions that you are not willing to make for that peace, you get no actual peace at all. See all of Adam's stuff that goes unresponded to about non-state actors. Because at the point at which people feel that they were sold out and they had to make concessions which they were never going to agree to, that they didn't think was worth it, that is the point at which non-state actors gain their legitimacy. That is the point at which if Hitler, so Michael's already Godwin, so I'm going to be able to say Hitler as well, but that's the point at which, right, the Nazis were able to say, look, someone else stabbed you in the back. Notice the Treaty of Versailles wasn't a referendum. Third point, he says that the state is always worse, right? He says that the state will always be worse at the point at which you know someone else voted for peace which you didn't want. First of all, we're willing to have, like, blind voting. We don't think everyone is going to know who voted for what, right? I mean, perhaps that's... But secondly, right, if you're willing to kill someone for voting for peace, you're probably going to kill them with or without the referendum in the first place, right? We say that actually war happens on both sides of the house in that scenario, and in fact it's less on our side because at least the person who voted for peace has the legitimacy of the majority. No, thank you. So then, moving on to this first point, what happens without these referenda? Because open governments show us, right, there are an entire mesh of incentives which mean that, like, generals, military-industrial complexes, politicians may never want to have peace, ever. In fact, maybe have financial incentives to continue that war. They note that this is terrible because they have no legitimacy in that. There is no legitimacy for the government to make that decision on behalf of the people, and it is unfair and it is unjust, right? No, thank you. Deny that this happens, okay? And also, notice the fact that there is the existence of peace without referendum isn't proof of the fact that we should never have referenda on peace, which seems to be their entire point with regards to Rwanda when they say, oh look, Rwanda was fine. Well, we probably postulate that Rwanda would probably have voted yes in the shall we have peace referendum as well. We think that's like the existence of peace without referenda isn't a reason to never have referendum. Okay, so then third to say like you need any peace to build any stability ever, to build civil services, to build trade partnerships. First of all, point out like the actual example that they use, which isn't Rwanda, which is the Jordanian Hashemite monarchy, is pretty brutal and isn't really genuine peace for a lot of people. Like it's not actually too great to be living in Jordan. And secondly, like Rwanda, not ruined by go on then.
There are going to be groups on either side that don't accept the peace deal. What do you think the Levant would look like in a scenario where the broadly unpopular peace agreement between Jordan and Israel had not been signed? What would it look like today there?
We imagine they'd probably have to go back to the table and renegotiate with like a legitimate political party that was still formed because there weren't non-state actors created because like they'd signed them off on concessions that they didn't want. We say that actually when referenda fail, which is what I'm going to get to in my second point, you go back to the table again for looking for a new peace deal, right? And thank God, as Adam shows you, you still go back with a group which has legitimacy, a group which is unified, and you can actually have those unilateral discussions with. Not 15 different terrorist organisations sitting in Gaza, all with different incentives, all with different plans. Right? Right then, so what does Adam show you in this world where without referenda? He shows you that when leaders leave their people, so the concessions that they do not want, those leaders then lose complete legitimacy. That Yasser Arafat lost his legitimacy at the point at which he signed the Oslo Accords. That Hamas gained its legitimacy at that exact moment as well, because suddenly they weren't just being sold out by the Israelis, but they were being sold out by Fatah, by the PLO. What's so dangerous about that, Mr. Speaker? Because at the point at which you have that, it's then impossible to ever have negotiations ever again. Because now people don't trust the political parties which were supposed to be bringing them peace. Now Hamas is able to say, look, they were willing to sell you out. They aren't actually on your side. They are the lapdogs, they are the cowards, they are the weaklings of the other side. They are here to attack you as much as the Israelis are, or in the case of the Treaty of Versailles, as much as as France and Britain were. What is so dangerous, therefore? Because at the point at which you have those non-state actors, it's then impossible to negotiate properly. It's impossible to negotiate properly when you have 15 different people to negotiate with who all have different interests. It's impossible to negotiate in that situation at all. Okay. Thank you. Second point. What happens then with these referenda? So first scenario, you agree to peace. No, thank you. In the first scenario where you agree to peace, we think that peace is pretty good, right? We say that peace is perhaps even better than the peace you would get without it, because now for once you're celebrating the day that you as a people chose peace together. It is a victory and a success for peace. We think that's great, but we don't think that's perhaps the most contentious point in this debate. I think everyone agrees that agreeing to peace is a good thing. What happens then when they disagree? Okay? Notice, first of all, that there often won't be peace on their side of the house anyway. Right? In a situation where so many people are opposed to peace, you won't have peace as it is. Either the leaders won't want peace, or the non-state actors will mean you will never get that peace in the first place because they will be doing things without consulting people, without consulting each other, and acting on their own. Right? You will never get that peace, see Gaza. You will have lots and lots of different people working on their own interests, maintaining that war, making it impossible to ever stop. Okay, so the non-state actors start again. Okay. Furthermore, however, in a situation with the referenda where they disagree, who are the non-state actors created now, right? Because people don't go, oh no, I've been sold out, because they haven't been sold out anymore. The only non-state actors are the ones who go, oh, I really want that peace. The non-state actors who want peace aren't going to be particularly famous for violently attacking people. For all those reasons, therefore, Mr. Speaker, because even with or without these referenda, we create more central and lasting peace. Very, very proud, for the last time, to stand aside for opposition.
I thank the government whip and call the opposition whip.
Bench New Zealand.
When we asked in a POI whether Israel would have been willing to enter into the negotiations that led to the Oslo Accords, the response we were given was that Palestinians liked the agreement, so they would have supported it anyway. The actor they missed in this question was Israel, because the Israeli politicians who have views about what the Palestinians are likely to accept would not likely have entered into those negotiations if they knew it would be eventually put into referendum. Because when you demonize a population, say they are so radical, say they are so different to you, you're unlikely to believe in their capacity to make concessions and make agreements. That destroys all incentive for you to enter into those negotiations in the first place. Sure, the PLO might have lost some legitimacy, but that's a world where Israel wouldn't even recognise the PLO, and there would be no vehicle for negotiation. We got the Oslo Accords, they would never have happened under their side. 2 points in this speech. First, who gets peace? Second, how do we maintain the peace? First, who gets peace? So their case essentially rested on the idea that warmongering generals who are corrupt and had massive control over governments would have neutrally worded questions put forward to the public at a time not chosen for their own political convenience. We thought the reality was rather different. Generals who, if we accept their analysis, have so much control over the state and the ability to choose whether they continue to wage war, would be able to decide to put a bad agreement before the public, to reject it and gain a mandate to continue that war and show that the public were on that side, thus relieving the international pressure that is standing against them. Furthermore, they'd be able to say that that war was something legitimate and was something they were going to be able to continue. they wanted to talk a lot about non-state actors. This was irrelevant in this debate because non-state actors aren't going to stop just because 51% of people make a given decision. There are always going to be people in the minority who are aggrieved about decisions. So it is the case that the moderate Muslim leaders probably aren't going to be able to negotiate on behalf of ISIS. They're not going to be able to have this accepted in a referendum either. It's no different on either side of this debate. The difference is that we get the peace in the first place. They wanted to talk about democratic legitimacy. The problem with democracy is it's often difficult to weigh up how people's preferences change over time. So one of the difficult issues is within democracy is it's hard to weight the views of people not yet born or people who are going to live in the future. A more subtle problem is the fact that people's views change over time, and it's unclear why we should trust the views of people now who are living in a state of war where they have been told that another ethnic group is their enemy and have been radicalised alongside opposition to that enemy, as opposed to people who have had 3 years of economic progress and 3 years of peace. We at least get that peace and allow people to move forward, and we trust the decisions and the preferences of people are better represented in the future where they have been able to have a state that hasn't been destroyed and ravaged by war. The example we heard in the last speech given was, but the French gave Algeria lots of resources. Well, they didn't hold a referendum on the withdrawal from Algeria, and it would have been less likely that they would have done so if the average French citizen knew they were giving an African colony plenty of resources as opposed to helping the welfare of French people. Those are the sorts of decisions that are made when the public is able to make decisions rather than politicians who are able to act according to longer-term international interests. The reason we were able to move towards the Dayton Accords was because there was massive international pressure from the United States and European countries, which placed huge sanctions and essentially alienated Serbia outside of the international community. These are the sorts of concerns which seem largely irrelevant when you're a citizen, but are hugely relevant when you're a politician. That's why they're far more likely to be taken into account by politicians, so we actually get an end to that peace. So that's why we got the peace through the Dayton Accords, because politicians were able to recognise the international incentives that an individual living in Serbia probably doesn't appreciate. Go.
The point isn't if non-state actors are happy or unhappy. It's that when you have a situation where the population are unhappy, those non-state actors are able to capitalise and lead to a non-lasting peace, right? It's less trivial than you may have ever seen.
So, yeah, non-state actors will exist regardless, but when you show people what the peace has meant and that the war has stopped, we think that's a better outcome and people's preferences change. So people are able to see that the peace has generated good results and they're less likely to support the radical notions that non-state actors are believing in. Now let's look at how we maintain that peace. It was excellent that opening government characterised this debate in terms of civil wars and ethnic conflicts within nations, because that played right into our extension. Because when you have individual politicians who have made abstract decisions on an international level according to negotiating principles, it's much harder to blame the person living down the street who happens to be of a different race to you. They told us, but you won't be able to identify that a given race or a given group of people were responsible for that vote because we had blind voting. They probably meant secret voting. Blind voting was another debate at this tournament. But more to the point, if you are someone who is racist and has already been radicalised against a given group, then it's pretty easy for you to think, who was this 20% that voted against the peace? It was probably the group that I already hate and I already believe it was fighting against my ethnic group's interests. So people use the exact prejudices they have at the moment and use that regardless of whether the vote is secret or not. That distrust exists regardless, and people are less likely to be able to move forward. You're more likely to to radicalise along those lines when you see that the people of the other ethnic group were the enemy within, who voted against the peace because they believed that that peace was on unfair terms. So you're able to say and blame certain groups for that war. So one of the greatest problems in adjudicating the conflict in Yugoslavia was the fact of that the apportionment of blame was a critical issue and a sticking issue for many people. When you specifically say there is a certain group who refuse to end this war and wanted the carnage and bloodshed to continue, you allow yourself to say that that group was in the wrong and that minority was responsible for the suffering that you and your family had inflicted upon you. That means you're able to blame that entire group and collectivize the guilt for that war. Regardless of the true political actions, you fall into the simplistic narratives based on the prejudices you already have. We want good international negotiation to occur that doesn't occur on their side, and we don't want the inter-ethnic tensions being inflamed. Super proud to oppose.
Thank you all for an excellent debate, and I'll see you